Barry Michael Aldridge is a multi-award winning, art school trained, Chartered Institute of Marketing qualified designer, fellow member, and fully chartered marketeer. In this video podcast series, Train of Thought, Barry takes a deep dive into the subject of digital disruption.
I'm absolutely delighted, and it's a privilege today to be joined by Alec Ross, New York Times bestselling author. Alec, for people that don't know who you are, can you introduce yourself and give a bit of background about your work and what you're currently focusing on today?
Sure, and thank you for having the opportunity to have me on today, and thank you to all of you who are listening. My name is Alec Ross. I have a background as I was actually a school teacher. I started teaching little kids in a low-income community in Baltimore, Maryland. And while I was teaching these young kids, I realized, oh my gosh, the jobs in the ports, factories, mines, and mills are going away. This was the 1990s. So I started a social enterprise, a nonprofit organization, the purpose of which was to help people from poor communities build the skills to get jobs in the high-tech workforce. I did that for 8 years, and during that, I got to know Barack Obama because he was then a local official working on the south side of Chicago. And so I got involved in his political life a little bit. I ran tech and media policy for his first presidential campaign, and then worked for 4 years at the State Department while he was president. And since leaving government, since those 6 years working for President Obama, I've been teaching. So now I'm a business school professor in Italy at the University of Bologna Business School. I write books, including the one we are going to discuss. And I do a little bit of investing, everything from a bakery in Italy to high-tech AI stuff and everything in between.
Brilliant, good stuff. And before we get into the book, I've got a couple of icebreaker questions for you. First one is, when you think about digital disruption, what does that mean to you?
What it means to me is taking practices from our past and wiping them out and bringing them into the future. So like, I'll give you a really silly example. When I was growing up in the 1970s, rich people had a color TV, middle class people had a black and white TV, poor people had no TV. Today, everybody has these advanced electronics with 300 channels on them. Why is that? That was because really of digital disruption, both on the hardware side as well as on the transmission side. And so it's about the continuous realization of the future.
Brilliant, good stuff. Yeah. And secondly, when you think about innovation, what does that mean to you?
My definition for innovation is the creation of new products or processes that allow for the continuous realization of the future. So it can be a product, it can be a new thing like a smartphone, or it can be a new process. It can be a new way of doing things.
Brilliant. And final icebreaker question. When you think about EDI, so that's equality, diversity, and inclusion, how important is that to you?
So I would say that D and I are more important than E in this case because I care more about equity than I do about equality. And I think that deserves a little bit of an explanation. I think that equality, agendas that are really rooted in equality don't account for our humanity. I think that's part of why communism and socialism failed, because it was sort of everybody will have the same outcome. So it's sort of equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. And the reason why I like the word equity more than I like equality is because it presumes more equal access to opportunity than outcome. So while I do think that we need to make sure that we have an inclusive society, so I like the E and the I. I mean, I like the D and the I a lot. I think our goal shouldn't be that everybody's equal, but that everybody has equal access to opportunity. And within that, I actually think that diversity and inclusion create opportunities for innovation. So it's poorly known, for example, but 40% of the Fortune 500, those are America's 500 biggest companies, were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. And so, right now, the CEOs of Microsoft and Google and IBM and so many other companies come from diverse backgrounds. So I actually see it less as something that holds people back or holds society back or holds a company back, and something that actually propels it forward. Again, principally for reasons of equity as opposed to, let's say, equality.
Okay, perfect. So 2026 is the 10th anniversary of your first book, and I've got the copy here. It's not in bad condition. So the industries of the future. So I want to tell you a bit about how this book came onto my radar. So at the time, I was working for an American franchise company, and it was my job to travel all over the UK and visit franchise business owners and work on marketing plans. And a lot of it was digital. That was the big driver. Lots of localized websites and getting them found online. So on this particular day, I was driving down to Southampton, and that's about 2.5 hours from where I live. And you came onto the radio. It was Radio 2. It was Jeremy Vine. And you were talking about this book. And it was all this stuff that I was interested in. You were talking about the Internet of Things and robotics and mobile first stuff. And I thought to myself straight away, I've got to buy a copy of this book. And there were a couple of things that I was working on at the time and really got inspired by your writing. So I was working on a insurance app. So it was basically an app on a phone that you could do remote live streaming and claims. So that was very much a big project that I was involved with. And then a couple of months after reading your book, I kind of moved jobs and I went to a manufacturing company. And you'd made me realise about the increasing risk of cybercrime and the possibility of a global cyber attack. And I got the company that I was now working for, Cyber Essentials, off the back of it. And that's a UK accreditation where you have to get as cyber secure as you possibly can. So I did that. And literally a few months after that, the WannaCry attack happened. So it proved everything that I was reading in your book to be true. But the thing as well was I was able to take these ideas back to the marketing team and share it with them, things that I felt were really important. And it was things like Internet of Things, it was big data and data protection and cyber defense and all that good stuff. So for me, it was a really tangible book that I could really get stuck into and apply it to my work. And I would actually say, Alec, it kind of changed my focus and my direction of where I wanted to take my career. So that is me. And
Wow,
that's,
thank you, Barry.
yeah, I
It's a
mean,
big deal.
okay, Alec, so straight into it. Chapter 1, Here Come the Robots. So I've got some questions for you, and I'm going to read out quite a few bits of your 2016 book. So firstly, in chapter 1, you explained that Japan faces a demographic crisis. There simply won't be enough humans to care for the elderly. So out of necessity, there's been a significant investment in robotic care. You wrote that between 2010 and 2025, the number of Japanese citizens aged 65 or older was expected to increase by 7 million. So my question to you, Alec, is now we're in 2026, did Japan's over 65 population increase by the 7 million that you predicted? Has it exceeded that figure? Or is it something more complex than that? Something more complicated than a simple increase in numbers?
No, there's actually a number. It's 7.2 million.
Wow.
So my prediction was, over 90%, 95% accurate. And, I
Mm,
thought it would be 7 million more based on my estimates. It was 7.2. So very, very close. So
very close.
the aging and the demographic changes of Japan have accelerated in this sort of scary way in which we thought would happen. And so the conditions we imagined for needing home care robotics back then,
Mm.
because there wouldn't be enough grandchildren to take care of the grandparents, that proved to be true.
Yeah, yeah. And that's obviously still a major issue today, isn't there? There's still this massive need for robotic care.
There is, and as I hope we'll be able to discuss, there are different cultural issues around this.
Yeah.
I have parents. My father is 86. My mother is 83. My father is in not great shape. Um, so we got him some help, but it's human help. It's not robotic help, and
Mm.
that's a personal choice. In our case, we have the financial resources to be able to offer that, but it's also not just a financial choice, but also a choice rooted in culture and identity and other factors. In
Yeah.
Japan, those dynamics are different.
And that kind of leads me into Shinto. So you mentioned in chapter one that in the West, the word robot is typically viewed as a negative. So you typically think of things like Terminator, and you think of a robot being a baddie. Um, but in Japan, the faith of Shinto makes them more accepting of robots. So can you explain more what Shinto is?
Sure. So Shinto is the dominant religion in Japan. It's the dominant belief system. More than 80% of Japanese citizens identify with Shinto. And in Shinto, unlike Judeo Christian traditions like those that dominate in Europe and the United States, they believe that every object has a soul.
Mm,
Um, so they don't see robots as being quote unquote the other. They don't view this hard distinction between the soulless machine and the soulful human that we have in Judeo-Christian, within our Judeo-Christian belief set. And interestingly, even the word robot comes from a Czech-rooted word meaning slave. And so there was always this concept of robots representing otherness. And even within Europe, for example, there are differences. So in Mediterranean and Southern Europe, automation and robotics is viewed more hostilely uh, than it is in more Calvinist Northern European contexts. So the degree to which things like robots in the workplace or in the home is viewed as something welcoming or something scary is rooted deeply in culture and religion.
yeah, perfect. And in fact, one of the things when I brought your book back to the marketing team in 2016, I was talking about robots. And I was talking about, because it was a commercial cleaning franchise company, that particular one. And I was talking about the possibility of having a robotic cleaner doing things like airports and what have you. Perfectly possible because Manchester Airport here in the UK had a robot cleaner back in 2000, 2001, I believe. But the team were absolutely petrified about the whole concept of robots and why I was even bringing it to the table. And that's what I called began to call the fear factor. And I've seen it a lot since, this fear of robots and a misunderstanding in the West of what they actually are. So I guess, Alec, my question to you on that is, do you ever come across with the subjects you talk about, kind of denial, fear, ridicule? Is that quite a common reaction for you?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting, though. I split my time almost evenly between the United States and Italy. And in the
Mm,
United States, there's much less of it. There's much less of that fear. And it's because, Americans are culturally are entrepreneurs. The very act of crossing the ocean and choosing to live somewhere else. The pioneers, go west, young man.
mm,
Entrepreneurship and sort of this cowboy mentality, innovation are much more deeply rooted in American culture than in, say, European culture. And Italy, which has a very, continues to have deep roots in its Catholic history, the fear factor around technological change is huge.
mm,
It was true with digitization 25 years ago. A lot of Mediterranean states were very slow to digitize, to get the fast internet, to convert processes to digital processes. And on the topic of artificial intelligence and robotics, they're scared to death. They're
Mm,
scared to death. So, I'll just give you what might seem like a silly example. If you go to LinkedIn, I follow, in LinkedIn, I have a presence that is, let's call it bilingual. It's English speaking and it's also Italian. I would argue that the content that is English speaking is probably three times more positive than the content in Italian as it relates to artificial intelligence and robotics. But interestingly, the UK has a more mixed history on this. Luddism has its roots, of course, with Nicholas Ludd and, the looms of Northern England. So there is a lot of fear. I think the fear is only going to accelerate now that we see artificial intelligence doing roles that is not nearly manual and routine, but cognitive and non-routine.
mm.
So I think there's some segment of society will remain fearful, and perhaps there may be even sort of a political backlash to it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So as we go into continue with chapter one, so back in 2016, Alec, you wrote rival Japanese companies Toyota and Honda were leveraging their mechanical engineering expertise to invent the next generation of robots. And you gave two examples, a few examples like Toyota's Robina and her brother, Humanoid, as well as Honda's Asimo. And I believe Asimo retired in 2022. You also pointed out this was interesting. These companies weren't healthcare organizations, and yet they were designing robots to care for the elderly. Um, so, my question to you on that, Alec, is was this industrial shift in Japan to robotics driven by political and sociological necessity? And to what extent did government pressure or national policy effectively push these manufacturers into the healthcare sector?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what I would say is that sociological and economic factors were dominant. So you did have this aging population. You did have a workforce that was growing older, and automation gave Japanese companies the opportunity in part to be more productive without having more employees. So there was a sort of industrial imperative behind it. What was the role of the state in this? It's very interesting. The state was supportive, but ultimately there are these things in Japan called kairetsu. Kairetsu are groups of companies that are highly aligned with one another. So if you think about, a football pitch with 11 different players on the pitch, all playing for one team. A kairetsu is, you can imagine it as sort of 11 different companies that don't compete with one another. They have different roles,
Mm.
um, but they play together as a team. And so while there were incentives at the policy level from the Japanese government, it was really these big kairetsu going in the direction of automation and robotics that pushed the country so far ahead.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that's quite unusual to have different companies not competing against each other and actually aligning drives innovation, doesn't it? So that pushed it all forward, really. So that's quite unusual here in the West to have companies join together like that, isn't it?
I think the Kairetsu model is unique. There's a
Mm.
different model, I think called Chaebol in South Korea, which were companies that used to all be owned by the state that then privatized, and then they work together and they work highly aligned with the state. But in general, what oftentimes happens is you see either competition or collaboration on an as needed basis. So in Silicon Valley, for example, it's frequently the case that companies will fight like hell with one
Mm.
another during the day for market share, but then they'll collaborate on policy issues at night, so to
Yeah.
speak. But it's never as formal as it is in South Korea or Japan.
Okay. Fascinating. And you said in 2016, Alec, that about 70% of total robot sales took place in Japan, China, United States, South Korea, and Germany. And they were referred to as the Big Five. So, what's the state of play today? Who are the top five countries for robotics? And who would you say is the global leader? And why is that?
So the funny thing is that the top five, the big five 10 years ago are the big five today. They are
Mm,
the exact same countries. The difference is that China has grown stronger. So China 10 years ago was creating robotics that were sort of low end and consumer focused as opposed to high end and industrial. What's happened is China has gone up market in terms of the kinds of robots it's producing and the kinds of automated industrial processes. So it's gone up market and it's also just gotten bigger. So China was merely one of the top five 5 years ago. It now has a much higher market share today. Today, the two most powerful countries in this domain are the United States and China. Those are the two that have invested the most over the last 10 years. There's still excellence from the other three, from South Korea, Japan, and Germany, though I would argue that Germany is lagging behind a bit. It's not as in strong position as it was 10 years ago. But the Chinese are racing ahead, and the United States as well. There's a little bit of a different emphasis in what they're investing in. The Chinese are really focusing much more on heavy industrial processes, warehouse automation, car production, things like this. But the big five 10 years ago in robots are the big five today in robots.
Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting to see that shift with China as well, isn't it? So they really have ramped up the gears with their manufacturing, haven't they?
They have. And to your earlier question about the role of the government with Japan, the government played what I would call, as I said, an encouraging but not heavy-handed role. The opposite has been the case in China, where the government was just kind of like, we are all in on this. So they set in an agenda, the 2030 AI agenda, which has robotics at its core. This since the publication of the book. And so the state really did drive behavior of individual companies over the last 10 years to help China accelerate. And they've done so successfully.
Yeah. Brilliant. So you mentioned, Alec, this is going back to culture here. You talked about the rest of the world moving toward the same kind of sociological crisis that Japan has been facing for years: aging populations, shrinking human workforces, and rising pressure on care systems. We're seeing signs of that here in the UK. And I'm curious, how difficult is it going to be for Western societies to accept robots as carers and companions compared to Japan?
It'll be much more difficult. So the challenge here, Barry, is really one of productivity. If you don't have the workforce, then you either have to become more productive or you have to welcome in more immigrants.
Mm.
And as we know, these issues are all entwined. So if you say, "Oh no, we want to control immigration more," then you need to become substantially more productive with the humans that you have, and then you have to be able to automate a series of processes. And home care will be part of that. It's not necessarily something that is welcomed, but you sort of have a choice. Are you going to do this? Or are you going to become more productive? Or are you going to bring in more immigrants?
Yeah. And I saw it myself. I asked a question to a relative of mine: how would you feel about having a robot take care of you?
Mhm.
And she was shocked and horrified about the whole concept. So it is that psychological kind of brick wall there, isn't it? So
Yeah, I think that, culture matters. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of this in Asia than we are in the West. So I do not anticipate we're going to have robo caregivers filling up the nursing centers in the West anytime soon.
no, definitely not. So in 2016, you highlighted two breakthroughs that were making it possible for robots to take on more human-like tasks. Things that require situational awareness, spatial reasoning, dexterity, contextual understanding, and even elements of judgment. And you pointed to improvements in modeling belief space and the uplink of robots to the cloud. So I'd like to unpack that with you. Firstly, could you explain to me what belief space actually is?
Sure. So if you think about when we say modeling belief space, if you think about the image of robots from the past, they moved almost two dimensionally.
Mm.
It was very, and the reason for that is that certain tasks that are very complex to model out mathematically and therefore to program algorithmically. Things like grasping. Grasping
Yeah.
might seem like a very simple task, but it's actually very complex mathematically and therefore very difficult to program algorithmically. But mapping belief space, which is this sort of, let's call it third space, advances in mathematics made the coding easier. So if you look at the robots of 30 years ago, they could only do almost, right angle like functions. Whereas today they're increasingly three-dimensional and non-routine. So instead of performing the same task 50,000 times, it can do non-routinized work because there's a level of cognition. And the reason why it's possible to have a level of cognition is because of the cloud. So instead of having, let's say, a robot that has 10 million pounds worth of software and hardware
Yeah.
whirling around inside its bronze body or whatever it is, as long as it is a connected device and as long as it is connected to the cloud, all of that processing power, all of that software can live in the cloud and be used on an as needed basis. Software as a
Yeah.
service delivered wirelessly. So the robots themselves can actually be relatively low cost, almost dumb devices, so long as
Yeah.
they are connected to this very powerful 5G enabled brain.
And I was going to ask you actually about, you mentioned the cloud. Um, is cloud computing still as important today as it was back in 2016?
It's more important. So it's fascinating. Everything we do right now is largely rooted, whether we know it or not, in the cloud. Even the CIA, even the Pentagon, all of our most sensitive defense and intelligence related agencies, they work in the cloud now. The idea of having something, a closet with a server rack in it, what
Yeah.
we've seen is that closet with a server rack is actually much more vulnerable than the most powerful forms of protected cloud infrastructure. Why? Because the cloud providers can put literally billions,
Mm.
billions with a B, of security behind it. Not just software security, but human security behind it. Much more so than is the case with that stack of servers that used to exist inside every office building.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think though we could be too reliant on the cloud? I mean, we had an instance last year. A couple of major cloud providers went down and it kind of caused global disruption. And is there an argument to say that maybe that should all be segmented and fragmented a bit?
So yes and no. The thing is, segmented and fragmented, you're going to have more failures than you would with a cloud-based solution. Nothing is perfect, but the cloud is pretty darn close. The fact that we remember an incident from a year or two ago that had a couple hours of disruption is the
Yeah,
exception that proves the fact, right? So what the key thing here is redundancy. If something goes down, there needs to be something else that can go up in real time. That I think is the real lesson. It's not cloud good, cloud bad. We should, have a more fragmented and distributed system. We should have redundancy. So if one thing goes down, something else goes right up. And I think that's
yeah,
sort of the key lesson from this.
yeah. And I think that was aging infrastructure and stuff like that, wasn't it? That was the failure of a couple of clouds last year.
Yeah, and that goes to the point of redundancy. And
Yeah,
this is true not just related to cloud, but our supply chains. If you think about some of the problems that we had during COVID, if you think about some of the problems that we had, with lack of access to semiconductors and other such things,
mm,
those things were rooted in what were very tightly wound, efficient supply chains without redundancy. I think what we know is that we live in a world of fallibility, and therefore we have to have redundancy in everything, whether it's a cloud solution, whether it's a supply chain, whatever else it is.
yeah, definitely. So back to chapter one, you also write with regards to robotics. There were advances in material science, transforming the physical construction of robots. And you've touched on this actually, moving them away from clunky aluminium shells into bodies made from silicon, spider silk, air muscle systems, polymers, and ferrofluids. And you were describing how robots were already beginning 10 years ago to look and move in ways that were far more natural and far less mechanical. So, I guess how much, Alec, has that advanced? And are today's humanoid robots, what are they like compared to their earlier generations in terms of their physical capability and their human like appearance?
So they're more three dimensional, they're more fluid and more human like. The Chinese have actually probably made the most interesting advancements here, but a choice has been made to not try to make them look exactly like humans. So they sort of deliberately look like robots. Nobody,
Yeah,
there aren't fake faces being put on them. The hands look more robotic than human, and this is a deliberate choice so as to create a real visual distinction and therefore emotional and cultural distinction between that which is human and that which is robotic.
yeah, definitely. And that makes perfect sense. It's a psychological thing, isn't it?
It is. It's 100% psychology. And I think that's important. In a world where humans are becoming more like machines and machines are becoming more like humans, being able to define and have some boundaries and make some choices to make the distinction between that which is human and that which is mechanical is important.
Yeah, definitely. So you talked in chapter one about nano robots. Okay, so these were machines far smaller than a grain of sand, capable of diagnosing and treating diseases at the cellular level. So 10 years on, Alec, what is the current trend with nanobot technology? Are we close to seeing it used in real world everyday medicine?
What's interesting is now that we have such great scanning technology, I think that the direction things are moving into is less nanobots and more advanced scanning. So
Mm,
you can sit in something that looks almost like an MRI machine. And this is something that, rich people are already using, and their entire body gets scanned. And you're able to draw information, data, harvest information out of it that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to. And so I think that really advanced scanning in here using AI. So AI has the ability to detect and see things that sometimes the human eye doesn't. So the data from a scan gets fed into a program which has AI um, working with humans to do the diagnostics.
yeah, brilliant. So that's kind of answered my next question. Has anything else emerged that's superseding nano robots? So is there still a need for nano robots today?
So I think that there is, but they'll be directed by artificial intelligence systems. So the real breakthrough here is AI. There are four different kinds of artificial intelligence. There is perceptive artificial intelligence, there's generative artificial intelligence, there's agentic artificial intelligence, and there's physical artificial intelligence. So nano robots, these little robots, are part of what we call physical AI. That is AI systems that have a physical manifestation. And so we see it in the life sciences, but the place where we really see it even more is in agriculture, interestingly enough.
Mm,
And so the real development here is the combination of robotics with advanced AI systems.
brilliant. So you go on in chapter one, Alec. You talk about driverless cars, and you introduced Google X, and that's now Alphabet's Waymo. Um, and you describe them as the market leader in autonomous vehicle and driverless technology. So what fascinated me here is that Google isn't even a car manufacturer, yet it seems to be out innovating the automotive industry. So who would you say, Alec, are the global leaders in driverless technology today?
So I think the best is still that Google car. It was spun
Mm,
off as a different company called Waymo, but today's Waymo was the Google car of 10 years ago.
mm,
When I am in Austin, Texas, when I'm in San Francisco, when I'm in different cities around the United States, I don't take a taxi with a human. I take a Waymo. And the reason for it, first and foremost, two big reasons are cost and safety. So it costs less than a driver with a human because the most expensive part of operating a taxi is paying the driver. And then secondly, it's safer. We know this because we have millions and millions and millions of miles of data that shows that humans are actually much more dangerous drivers than autonomous drivers.
Mm.
So this is something where the technology has really caught up. I can't wait for it to come to Baltimore, where I live when I'm in the United States. I think regulation will keep it out of a lot of places where the taxi lobby will fight it.
Yeah.
But in general, I think the technology that was very frontier technology 10 years ago is now completely mainstream. I mean, I use it. I use driverless cars and I don't give it a second thought.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think we'll come into that a bit later on. But I guess then, if you look at the past decade, Alec, has autonomous vehicle has AV grown as quickly as you'd expected, or has it turned out to be a bit of a slow burner? And if so, what's holding it back?
I think that, I don't know how quickly I expected it. Back then, what I will say is, if it isn't in 100 different cities in the US by 2030, I'll be surprised. The Chinese have already moved very far ahead. The biggest thing here is really political regulation and culture. So, this is a case where labor substitution absolutely comes into play. So if buses and trucks and taxis are driven autonomously, then you are displacing a sort of blue collar worker. And
Yeah.
so I think that this is a case where Europe will be I think Asia will be furthest ahead. They already are. Next will be the United States, and then the Europeans will sort of come up after them.
Mm. Well, that brings me on perfectly to robo taxis. So, fully autonomous taxi services operating in major cities around the world. And you just touched on that. So, how disruptive do you think robo taxis will be to the international job market for taxi drivers?
Um, I think that it'll wipe them out at some point, except where they're made illegal. So in San Francisco and in Austin, Texas, which are the two places I've taken them, like there's literally no good reason to have a human-driven taxi. Um, so the technology will be there. The only thing that'll hold it back is going to be politics and regulation.
Yeah.
So do I think that, is it a good idea to start a career and plan a long-term career being a taxi driver? Only if you live in a place where the government will keep them out.
Mm, definitely. So, you do talk a lot about the far-reaching threat of human job displacement, and I think most people are used to hearing about robotics in manufacturing, automotive plants, production lines, that sort of thing. But the impact now, it seems to me, is stretching much wider. We're seeing it with robo taxis, as you mentioned, and also across hospitality, warehousing, freight, haulage, so in the context of the industries of the future, how close do you think we are in 2026 to a mass of global work displacement across many different sectors and industries?
I mean, that's a reasonable question. And basically, you could come up with any number, and there'll be a study to support that number. I'm not a catastrophist in this. I think that, what usually is the case is we tend to overestimate what's going to happen in the short term and underestimate what's going to happen in the long term. And while I do think that robotics are a key part of this, I think that generative artificial intelligence is going to play an even more dominant role
Mm,
in labor change in the future.
yeah, and that's things like professional jobs, isn't it? That's things like marketing, legal stuff like that, HR.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of legal, my father, who I mentioned earlier, he's 86 years old. What he was a lawyer. He was sort of a country lawyer. In a small town in West Virginia in the United States. And I think that 95% of what he did over the course of a 45-year long career is going to be done by AI. But here's the thing, that's difficult, but I think it's also positive. I think that because it creates an enormous amount of consumer surplus. And I'll just give you an example of that. Like, let's say you want to buy a home The way it works in the United States is buyer wants to buy, seller wants to sell. They then say, somebody, the lawyers and the accountants and everybody else then says, okay, we'll see you in a month and a half. And oh, by the way, it's going to cost you, £8,000 in fees for the closing costs. Well, instead of a month and a half, how about 3 days? And
Mm,
instead of £8,000 of closing costs, how about £18? So I do think that there are kinds of labor that create so much consumer surplus and so much good that we shouldn't whinge about it.
mm,
I do believe that. And, it's the same thing that happened with the mechanization of the farm. The fact that we don't have to have a scythe with which we cut, every batch of grain, but we have machines that can do these things for us. What does it do? It means that we can produce more food, we can create healthier food, we can create lower cost food. And the people who may have been working in fields before went to work in factories. People who went to work in factories then go on to work in services. So this is part. I'm not a utopian. There are very painful transitions, but this is evolution. We aren't all hunter gatherers anymore. Technological innovation allowed us to evolve past that. And so too, the idea that, a barrister would say, okay, you're going to pay me £8,000 in fees and I'll see you in 6 weeks, even though the buyer's ready to buy and the seller's ready to sell. The idea of that 6 week process becoming 3 days and that £8,000 expense becoming £18, I think it's worth it.
yeah, yeah, and definitely. I bought this place last year. I sold and moved here, and the legal fees were astonishing. So yeah, definitely, I can see a positive to AI on that front.
Mhm.
But I guess AI is just going to naturally come into this, isn't it? I mean, if we take it back to robotics, AI must have completely transformed how robots learn, interact with each other, and behave compared to earlier versions. And also, well, you've touched on that really. There's positives and negatives to AI, adding to the threat and accelerating job displacement. So, I guess just to discuss that, how much has AI transformed things over compared to 10 years ago?
This has been the single most important technological development over the last 10 years. What really began in earnest 4 and 5 years ago, where lots of investment produced breakthroughs in generative AI, this has had the most important impact. And we're now seeing it manifest itself in industry. So, we see it, for example, in precision agriculture, where farmers now use things that look like iPads to be able to manage their farms and figure out, what should the phosphorus nitrogen mix in the fertilizer be? Where should it be applied in the minimal dose necessary? When we're irrigating, how and where do we irrigate and at what levels should the water be used? AI integrating these sort of historic sectors of the economy has proven to be enormously powerful.
So, Alec, this book is understandably a hefty read, and I recommend it to everybody. There's 6 chapters in there, all of it covering really important topical stuff. So, I guess the question to you here is, without going through the entire book, really, but when you look at skill sets in the job market today, what do you think are the most valuable skills that people can have?
Let me cite a couple of them. So one and two right off the top: creativity and critical thinking. Creativity, why? Because true creativity is something that can't really be outsourced to the machines. And I think that, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in communications, whether you're in sales, whatever it is, I think that in a world, again, where humans are more like machines and machines are more like humans, that which makes us most human grows more increasingly appreciated. And at the core of that is creativity. So I actually think that with all this AI, the creative world is, and the appreciation of the creative world and creative skills is going to go up. Secondly, analytical skills. So if you think about, our large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, whatever you're using, it's using sort of next symbol and next word prediction. So, in a certain respect, it's sort of a reversion to the mean in terms of analytics. And everybody has that information. So, the ability to do really interdisciplinary analytical thinking that cuts across domains, that includes things like emotional intelligence, behavioral psychology, and other things like that kind of analytical thinking will be increasingly appreciated. Another thing that I'll point to is emotional intelligence and leadership. So again, in an almost world of the coldness of software, the ability to lead, the ability to have social influence in a way that isn't rigidly hierarchical, the ability to galvanize a team around a mission or around a goal, that's increasingly appreciated. And then the last thing that I'll point out is what I would call the intersection of the humanities with technical understanding. I'll just give you an interesting example, something like Facebook. Facebook was founded by a guy, Mark Zuckerberg. We all know this. And everybody knows that he studied computer science at Harvard. What they don't know is that he was a dual major. And the other thing that he studied was behavioral psychology. So Facebook, for example, was behavioral psychology and computer science coming together. That then became the basis for Instagram. It became the basis for TikTok. It became the basis for social media broadly. And I think in a lot of what our future workforce, what will be appreciated, are people who are able to take a technical understanding of something, whether it's scientific, whether it's technological, whatever that is, and then bring in the humanities. If you can put those two together, that kind of interdisciplinary learning, I think that is what's going to make us most resilient in the future.
Certainly. And from my point of view there, graphic designer and marketing, what does the future look like for me?
I think you really have to make a choice, Barry. Are you going to be the master of the technology, the slave of the technology, or are you going to pretend that it doesn't exist? And so what I would tell you is to use AI, for example, as a new tool in your toolbox.
Yeah.
In the same way in which graphic designers, no longer just take out pieces of paper and draw on it, or paint on it. It's already been digital interfaces for the most part for some time now. Figure out how to master the AI in such a way that it's working for you as opposed to you working for it. And then going back to what I said, just a few minutes ago, real creativity. You can ask an AI to produce a given image that reflects a series of things that you've prompted, but there's sort of a reversion to the mean with that. And so real creativity is using its productive capacity, but then overlaying what makes you unique to be able to draw out sort of the magic of a topic.
Yeah, case in point there. I can come up with an idea now that a couple of years back would have cost millions in budget, which I didn't have, but now I can conceptualize an idea and pump that into AI, and it's more of a tool. It's not an enemy. It's actually made me more productive and better.
No, that's exactly right. And this is consumer surplus. Like going back to the example of the lawyer no longer getting £8,000 from you, but rather a software company getting £18. It creates benefit for the people who are buying and selling the house. So too, if Barry, you had an idea, but it would have required millions of pounds, and that would have been both too expensive and too high risk. Now, if you can present a £5 million project for something at a fraction of a cost, then it will allow for you to operate at a scale that you didn't previously. And the giants out there suddenly have to compete with you because you have an army behind you, Barry.
Yeah, definitely. So, Alec, I'm curious, when you set about writing this book, did you expect it to become a New York Times bestseller?
Gosh, look, I'm an ambitious guy, but I don't think I set that specific goal. Sometimes these things take on a life of their own. And, I think that the industries of the future ended up being published in 24 languages. It's
Mm,
still used as a textbook in more than 50 universities around the world 10 years later. And so, would I have predicted that? No. But I will say it's been gratifying. And I'm gratified that it's not out of date. If anything, it's more accessible now than when I wrote it. When I wrote The Industries of the Future, a lot of it seemed like science fiction. A
mm.
lot of it seemed really out there. Now I think everybody sees it as being not just realistic, but what's actually happening.
Yeah, definitely. So, in terms of what you're working on now, is there a third book in the pipeline?
What I'm writing right now is this is a little different. So my first two books, The Industries of the Future and The Raging 2020s. Those two books were written for global audiences. This next third book of that I'm writing is just about Italy. It's called The Italian Dream. And so it's definitely a departure for me.
Mm,
The Industries of the Future and The Raging 2020s are the two books that are really global in nature. Anybody in any country in the world can read it and see in reading it, they can see themselves in that context. This third book is a narrower interest of mine, focused on my passion for Italy.
yeah, brilliant. So, when's that due to be out, Alec?
It's May 26th, 2026.
Okay, brilliant. So, yeah, good stuff. Well, Alec, I want to really thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And this was a book that definitely inspired me 10 years ago. And definitely recommend people to pick it up and read it. So, thank you very much, Alec.
Look, it's been a pleasure, and the fact that it inspired you, and the fact that it's been helpful to people is more gratifying than any number of book sales. So thank you, and thank everybody for listening in.
Brilliant. Thank you. I would like to say thank you to Alec Ross for taking the time out today to speak with me about his first book, The Industries of the Future. Whilst we only got to talk about chapter one, the book in its entirety is so important today, probably more relevant today than it was 10 years ago. So I do urge all of you to go out and buy a copy, order a copy, read it, absorb it, and sink it all in. So thank you very much, Alec. It really was a pleasure talking with you.